Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Dev Diary. We finish out the holiday festivities for the year with part 2 of our 2-part Dev Diary special, which if you missed part 1, you sure missed a lot. We covered basic player controls, weapon variants, and projectile behavior for said weaponry. We also covered an approach to visual scaling that I was experimenting with, and overall it was a good chunk of an attempt to keep things simple, but also try something new. So as we wrap things up, be sure to leave a like if you enjoyed today's video, and subscribe if you're new to the channel. Turn on notifications so you don't miss another episode, and with that said, let's finish this thing. We'll pick up where we last left off. Get it? Because we're starting with the pickups. Anyway, as mentioned in the last episode, pickups are activated when the player comes in contact with them, and depending on their type will provide either health or ammo. Eventually, pickups will disappear, signaled via a basic flickering effect. Now moving on to the enemies, there are 2 physical and 1 projectile based variants. The first is what I call the follower. It periodically shifts between 2 states. The first is the neutral state, in which the enemy does not move at all. The second is the attack state, in which the enemy will begin to slowly move towards the player. It's very zombie-like in its behavior. The second enemy is what I called the jumper. Like the follower, it has 2 states. However, in the jumper's case, the attack state is less of a follow and more of a leap towards the player's position. This enemy was inspired by the jumping spiders from Binding of Isaac, if it weren't obvious at this point. And obviously, touching these enemies, the player will take damage. Now, the third enemy variant is our shooter, and thanks to our usage of parents here, the shooters are basically AI versions of the player. They will occasionally move and fire their weapon, of which their aim is random to provide some unpredictability. Really, the only difference behavior-wise between player and shooter are the fact that enemies can only spawn with one of 3 gun types. And that does it for our enemy types, so let's talk about the gameplay loop. The player is given a target amount of enemies to defeat per round. Once that goal has been reached, a present is spawned in the middle of the play area. Touching this present gives the player a new weapon, the level is increased, and a new target is set. Rinse and repeat. And the game ends when the player loses all of their health. And fun little aside here, the present's colors are completely random. The sprites are broken down into layers and parts, and are then individually colored before stacked to look like a single object. Fun stuff. Now speaking of visuals, let's talk some final bells and whistles in the visual department. First, shoutouts for everything is drawn to a single surface, followed by a bunch of particles used in various places. These events include the spawning and despawning of presents, enemy spawns and eliminations, and weapon effects, such as the railgun sparkling on charge or an explosion of pixels when an enemy is smacked with a weapon. Finally, the HUD itself displays the player's health in a fancy overlay aesthetic, the player's current weapon, the current level, and the target number. An interesting note here again is the scaling. The health bar and the weapon silhouette are vector images. The text on the other hand is basically a PNG with no aliasing. And so with the text you see this obvious pixelation as the display scales upwards. And yet the vector art doesn't, remaining consistent regardless of scale. Which if you've worked with vectors before is not in itself too surprising. It's kinda the way that vectors work. However, it's interesting to see that gamemaker handles vector sprites differently in the GUI than say the general draw event. So I imagine with some tweaking, this could mean flawless visual scaling using just vector sprites. It's just disappointing that I only now realize its potential, considering how difficult it is to produce with files these days. Anyway, that was about all I was able to get to in terms of additions since last episode. I had plans for extra enemies, variants to the play area, and more visual effects. However, time was limited, so things remained simple. Still, it was cool to explore options for visual fidelity. I'd like to experiment more with vector art in the future, especially if that scaling approach is legit. So hopefully you learned a thing or two as well. If you did or would like to further enlighten us on anything discussed today, be sure to leave it in the comments. Also, if you would like to help support the continued creation of these videos, I'm now on Patreon. But with that said, thank you so much for watching, have a wonderful holiday or whatever remains of it, and a wonderful new year. I'll see you guys then with even more game dev goodness.